A black waitress named Marissa serves an old disabled man for many years. Then one day, Mr. Harrison hands her a shocking note that changes everything. What does this note reveal, and how will it transform Marissa's life? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Marissa Johnson stepped into the bustling kitchen of Le Petit Chateau, the fancy downtown restaurant where she had worked part-time for the past 4 years. The smell of freshly baked croissants and sizzling bacon filled the air, making her stomach growl. She tied her apron around her waist and grabbed her notepad, ready to start another busy Sunday shift. "Morning, Marissa," called out Chef Pierre from behind the stove. "Ready for another day?" She flashed him a bright smile. "You bet, Chef. Let's make it a good one." As Marissa made her way to the dining room, she thought about her goal. Every tip, every extra shift brought her closer to her dream of attending college. She was determined to make something of herself, to prove that a girl from a modest background could reach for the stars. The first few hours flew by in a whirlwind of orders, smiling faces, and the clink of silverware. Marissa moved gracefully between tables, her cheerful demeanor never wavering, even when faced with demanding customers. As the lunch rush began to slow, Marissa noticed a familiar face entering the restaurant. Mr. Harrison, an elderly white gentleman on his wheelchair, made his way to his usual table by the window. He came every Sunday like clockwork, always alone and always ordering the same meal. Marissa approached his table, notepad in hand. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. The usual today?" The old man nodded silently, his eyes barely meeting hers. Marissa couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity about this quiet, solitary figure. She had served him countless times, yet knew so little about him. "One roast beef sandwich and a cup of black coffee coming right up," she said with a warm smile. As she turned to leave, Mr. Harrison spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Thank you, miss." Those 3 words, so rarely heard from him, made Marissa's heart leap a little. She hurried to the kitchen, feeling a small sense of victory. When she returned with his order, Mr. Harrison was gazing out the window, lost in thought. Marissa set down his plate and coffee cup gently, not wanting to disturb him. "Enjoy your meal, sir," she said softly before moving on to her other tables. Throughout his meal, Marissa kept an eye on Mr. Harrison. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. As always, when he finished, he left a generous tip on the table. Marissa collected it gratefully, knowing it would go straight into her college fund. As Mr. Harrison made his way to the exit, Marissa called out, "Have a wonderful day, Mr. Harrison. See you next Sunday." He paused for a moment, turning to look at her. For a brief second, Marissa thought she saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone, and he nodded before stepping out into the afternoon sun. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marissa hung up her apron and bid farewell to her co-workers. She stepped out of Le Petit Chateau, the cool evening air a welcome relief after hours in the bustling restaurant. Her feet ached, but her heart felt light. Another day's work meant another step closer to her dreams. The bus ride home was quiet, giving Marissa time to count her tips. She smiled, knowing every dollar would go into her college fund. As the familiar streets of her neighborhood came into view, she felt a mix of comfort and restlessness. This was home, but she yearned for more. Marissa unlocked the front door of the modest 2-bedroom house she shared with her parents. The smell of her mom's famous pot roast greeted her, along with the sound of the evening news playing on the TV. "I'm home," she called out. Her mother, Lisa, poked her head out from the kitchen. "Hey, sweetie, how was work?" "Good, Mom, busy as always," Marissa replied, kicking off her shoes. Her father, James, looked up from his newspaper. "There's my college girl. Come here and give your old man a hug." Marissa laughed and obliged, feeling the warmth of her father's embrace. "Dad, I'm not in college yet." "But you will be," he said with unwavering confidence. "You've got the brains and the determination. You'll get there." Over dinner, Marissa shared stories from her day at the restaurant. Her parents listened attentively, their pride evident in their eyes. When there was a lull in the conversation, Marissa took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about applying to Westfield University," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. Her mother's eyes widened. "Westfield? That's a great school, honey, but isn't it expensive?" Marissa nodded, her fingers fidgeting with her napkin. "It is, but they have an amazing business program. I've been looking into scholarships and financial aid options." Her father reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "If that's where you want to go, we'll find a way to make it happen. Your mom and I didn't get the chance to go to college, but we want that for you." Tears pricked at Marissa's eyes. She knew how hard her parents worked, how much they sacrificed. The weight of their hopes, combined with her own dreams, felt heavy on her shoulders. "I know it's a lot of money," Marissa said softly, "but I promise I'll keep working hard and saving every penny. I want this so badly." Her mother stood up and wrapped her arms around Marissa. "We know you do, sweetheart, and we believe in you. You've always reached for the stars, and we'll be right here, cheering you on." The following Sunday arrived, and Marissa found herself back at Le Petit Chateau, ready for another day of work. As she tied her apron and smoothed her hair, she glanced at the clock. It was almost time for Mr. Harrison's usual arrival. Sure enough, at precisely 11:30 a.m., the elderly gentleman with his wheelchair came in through the door. His steps were slow but purposeful as he made his way to his regular table by the window. Marissa watched him settle into his seat, noticing the slight stoop of his shoulders and the faraway look in his eyes. Taking a deep breath, Marissa approached his table with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison. It's nice to see you again. Would you like your usual?" Mr. Harrison looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before darting away. He nodded silently, his fingers absently tracing the edge of the menu. As Marissa jotted down his order, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and black coffee, she felt a sudden urge to break through the wall of silence that always surrounded him. "It's a beautiful day out there, isn't it?" she ventured, gesturing towards the sunlit street outside. "Perfect for a Sunday stroll in the park." Mr. Harrison's gaze flickered to the window, then back to Marissa. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something, longing perhaps, in his eyes. But he simply nodded again, offering no words in response. Marissa's heart ached a little. She had seen Mr. Harrison every Sunday for the past 2 years, yet she knew nothing about him beyond his order and his generous tips. There was a sadness about him that she couldn't quite put her finger on, a loneliness that seemed to cling to him like a shadow. As she brought out his meal, Marissa tried once more. "I hope you enjoy your breakfast, Mr. Harrison. Is there anything else I can get for you?" This time, Mr. Harrison looked up at her, his expression softening ever so slightly. "No, thank you," he said, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. "This is fine." It wasn't much, but it was more than he usually said. Marissa felt a small thrill of victory. She gave him another smile before moving on to her other tables, her steps a little lighter. Throughout the meal, Marissa found her gaze drawn back to Mr. Harrison's table. She watched as he ate slowly, his eyes often drifting to the world outside the window. There was something about him that tugged at her heart, a silent bond forged through years of Sunday mornings spent in each other's quiet company. As Marissa finished her shift and headed home, her mind wandered to thoughts of family. The bus rumbled beneath her, carrying her through the bustling city streets towards the modest apartment she shared with her parents. Her mom and dad were her rocks, her biggest supporters in everything she did. Marissa smiled, thinking of how they'd always encouraged her dreams, no matter how big or small. But there was a shadow that lingered over their family, a piece of the puzzle that had always been missing. Marissa had never met her grandparents. The thought made her heart ache with a familiar longing. She knew the basics of the story. Her father, a kind-hearted black man, had fallen in love with her mother, a sweet white woman from a conservative family. Their love had been strong enough to overcome the prejudices of the world around them, but not everyone had been able to see past their differences. Her grandparents, her mother's parents, had cut ties when her parents got married. They couldn't accept their daughter's choice, and the rift had never healed. As the bus neared her stop, Marissa felt the weight of that loss settle on her shoulders. She had grown up hearing stories about family reunions, about grandparents who spoiled their grandkids with cookies and hugs. But for her, those were just stories, never a reality. She stepped off the bus, her feet carrying her down the familiar path to her building. The smell of her mom's cooking wafted down the hallway as she approached their apartment door. Inside, she found her parents in the kitchen, her dad helping her mom chop vegetables for dinner. "Hey, sweetie," her mom called out, wiping her hands on her apron. "How was work?" Marissa forced a smile, pushing away the melancholy thoughts. "It was good, Mom. Just the usual Sunday crowd." Her dad looked up from the cutting board, his eyes crinkling with concern. "You okay, Pumpkin? You look a little down." Marissa hesitated, then sighed. "I was just thinking about family, about Grandma and Grandpa." Her parents exchanged a look, a mixture of sadness and understanding passing between them. Her mom put down the spoon she was holding and came over to wrap Marissa in a hug. "Oh, honey," she said softly. "I'm so sorry. I know it's not fair that you've never gotten to know them." Marissa leaned into her mother's embrace, feeling the familiar ache of loss and longing for family connections she'd never had the chance to form. Another Sunday rolled around, and Marissa found herself at work once again, the familiar rhythm of the restaurant settling into her bones. As she bustled between tables, her eyes kept drifting to the door, waiting for the arrival of her most consistent customer. Right on cue at precisely 1 p.m., Mr. Harrison walked in. His white hair was neatly combed, and he wore his usual crisp shirt and tie. But today, something seemed different about him. Marissa couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was a shift in his demeanor that caught her attention. As she approached his table, notepad in hand, she offered him a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. The usual today?" He looked up at her, and Marissa was struck by the faraway look in his eyes. It was as if he was seeing her, but also looking beyond her, lost in some distant memory. "Yes, thank you, Marissa," he said softly, his voice carrying a hint of something she'd never heard before. Was it sadness? Regret? As she jotted down his order, the same as always, she couldn't help but notice how his gaze kept drifting to the window. He seemed more reflective today, almost wistful. His shoulders sagged slightly, and there was a heaviness about him that tugged at Marissa's heart. She wanted to ask if everything was all right, to offer a kind word or a listening ear. But she held back, respecting the quiet boundary that had always existed between them. Still, as she went to place his order, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was weighing on Mr. Harrison's mind. Throughout his meal, Marissa kept a watchful eye on him. She noticed how he ate more slowly than usual, pausing between bites to stare off into space. His customary newspaper lay untouched beside his plate, another departure from his normal routine. As the lunch rush began to slow, Marissa found a moment to catch her breath. She leaned against the counter, her eyes drifting once again to Mr. Harrison's table. Emily, her close friend and colleague, noticed Marissa's distracted gaze. "Penny for your thoughts?" Emily asked, nudging Marissa gently. Marissa sighed, turning to face her friend. "It's Mr. Harrison," she said softly. "He seems different today, more distant than usual, if that's even possible." Emily followed Marissa's gaze to the elderly gentleman sitting alone by the window. "He does look a bit down," she agreed. "I can't help but wonder about him," Marissa confided. "He's been coming here every Sunday for as long as I can remember, always alone. It just makes me sad to think about how lonely he must be." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "I've noticed him too. He's like clockwork, isn't he?" "Exactly," Marissa said. "But today, something's off. He hasn't even touched his newspaper. I just wish I knew more about his life, you know? What brought him here? Why is he always alone?" Emily placed a comforting hand on Marissa's shoulder. "You've got a big heart, Marissa, but remember, everyone's got their own story, their own burdens to bear. Maybe Mr. Harrison is dealing with something we can't see." Marissa considered this, her brow furrowing. "You're right. I guess it's easy to forget that everyone has their own struggles. even when they seem so put together on the outside. Exactly, Emily said with a gentle smile. Who knows what's going on in his life? Maybe he's lost someone or he's estranged from his family. Life can be complicated for anyone, regardless of age. Marissa nodded, her eyes once again drawn to Mr. Harrison's solitary figure. She felt a renewed sense of empathy for the old man, wondering what hidden pain he might be carrying. That evening, Marissa returned home, her mind still swirling with thoughts of Mr. Harrison and her own family. As she stepped through the door, the warm aroma of her mother's cooking enveloped her, instantly easing some of her worries. "I'm home," she called out, hanging up her coat. Her parents, James and Sarah, greeted her from the kitchen. Her father's deep, rich laugh mingled with her mother's lighter tones, creating a melody that always made Marissa smile. "Just in time for dinner, sweetheart," her mother said, placing a steaming dish on the table. As they settled around the table, Marissa felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Her parents' love and support had been unwavering, despite the challenges they'd faced as an interracial couple. "How was work today?" her father asked, passing her the salad bowl. Marissa hesitated, then shared her thoughts about Mr. Harrison. "It just got me thinking about family, you know? How important it is." Her mother reached out, squeezing Marissa's hand. "Family is precious, honey. We've always wanted you to have that sense of belonging." "I do," Marissa said, her eyes misting slightly. "You've both sacrificed so much for me. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Her father's expression softened. "Your success is all the repayment we need. We're so proud of you, working hard for your college dreams." They spent the rest of the evening talking about Marissa's plans for the future. Her parents listened intently as she shared her hopes and fears about college. "It's a big step," her mother acknowledged, "but you're ready for it. We've always known you were destined for great things." Marissa felt a lump form in her throat. "I just want to make you proud, to show that all your sacrifices were worth it." Her father leaned forward, his eyes serious. "Marissa, you've already made us prouder than we could have ever imagined. Your determination, your kindness, that's worth more than any degree." As the night wore on, Marissa found herself reflecting on the true meaning of family. It wasn't just about blood ties, she realized. It was about love, support, and the unbreakable bonds forged through shared experiences. The following Sunday arrived, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of Marissa's shift at the restaurant. As she made her rounds, attending to her tables with her usual warmth and efficiency, she couldn't help but glance towards Mr. Harrison's regular spot. He hadn't arrived yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. When Mr. Harrison finally walked in, Marissa greeted him with a smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. The usual today?" He nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, thank you, Marissa." As she turned to put in his order, she noticed something different on the table. A small, neatly wrapped package sat next to his place setting. Curiosity piqued. Marissa wondered what it could be. Throughout his meal, Mr. Harrison seemed more relaxed than usual, his eyes occasionally flickering towards Marissa with a hint of anticipation. When it came time for him to leave, he stood up slowly, leaving the package behind. "Have a good day, Mr. Harrison," Marissa called after him. He paused at the door, turning back to her. "You too, Marissa, and I hope you find that useful." Confused, Marissa approached the table to clear it. That's when she saw the package more clearly. With trembling hands, she unwrapped it to reveal a beautiful, leather-bound journal. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the cover and found a note inside. "For your journey ahead," it read in elegant handwriting. Tears pricked at Marissa's eyes as the weight of the gesture sank in. Mr. Harrison had been paying attention all this time, silently supporting her dreams. The journal was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of belief in her future. That evening, as Marissa sat at her desk at home, she ran her fingers over the smooth leather of the journal. She couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Harrison's kindness. Taking out a piece of paper, she began to write a heartfelt thank you note, planning to give it to him on his next visit. The following Sunday arrived with an air of anticipation. Marissa's heart fluttered as she saw Mr. Harrison enter the restaurant. She smoothed her apron, feeling the weight of the thank you note in her pocket. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison," she greeted him warmly. "Your usual table is ready." He nodded, a gentle smile on his weathered face. "Thank you, Marissa." As she led him to his table, Marissa's fingers brushed against the note in her pocket. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice soft, "I wanted to thank you for the beautiful journal. It means so much to me." She pulled out the carefully folded note and handed it to him. Mr. Harrison's eyes widened slightly, a look of surprise and warmth crossing his face. "That's very kind of you, Marissa. I'm glad you liked it." To Marissa's astonishment, Mr. Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. He held it out to her, his hand trembling slightly. "I have something for you too," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "Please, read it after your shift. It's important." Marissa took the envelope, her fingers brushing against his. She felt a jolt of curiosity and nervousness. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. I will." Their eyes met for a moment, and Marissa saw a mix of emotions swirling in Mr. Harrison's gaze. Hope, fear, and something that looked like regret. The air between them felt charged with unspoken words. "Your usual order?" Marissa asked, trying to maintain her professional demeanor despite the weight of the moment. Mr. Harrison nodded, breaking the spell. "Yes, please." As Marissa turned to put in his order, she couldn't help but wonder about the contents of the envelope. It felt heavy in her apron pocket, like it held more than just paper. She glanced back at Mr. Harrison, who was now staring out the window, lost in thought. Throughout her shift, Marissa's mind kept drifting to the envelope. She sensed that whatever was inside would change things between her and Mr. Harrison. The anticipation built with each passing hour, making her both eager and anxious for her shift to end. As the last customer left and the restaurant quieted, Marissa's shift finally came to an end. Her heart pounded with anticipation as she untied her apron and reached for the envelope. She found a quiet corner in the break room, away from her co-workers' curious glances. With trembling fingers, Marissa carefully opened the envelope. Inside, she found a neatly folded letter. The paper felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of years of unspoken words. She took a deep breath and began to read. "Dear Marissa, I hope this letter finds you well. I've watched you grow into a remarkable young woman over these past few years, and I can no longer keep my silence. My name is Robert Harrison, and I am your grandfather." Marissa's breath caught in her throat. She blinked rapidly, sure she had misread the words, but as her eyes scanned the page again, the truth sank in. Her hands began to shake. The letter continued. "I know this must come as a shock to you. I've remained silent all these years out of shame and regret. When your mother, my daughter, married your father, I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. I disapproved of their interracial marriage and cut ties with them. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I've spent years regretting my actions, too ashamed to reach out and make amends. Watching you from afar has been my way of staying connected to the family I foolishly pushed away." Tears welled up in Marissa's eyes as she read on. Mr. Harrison, her grandfather, poured out his heart, explaining his silence, his regret, and his deep desire to make things right. As she reached the end of the letter, Marissa felt overwhelmed. Her mind raced with questions and emotions. The kind, quiet man she had served for years was actually her grandfather. The grandfather she had never met, the one who had caused her parents so much pain. Marissa sat in stunned silence, the letter clutched tightly in her hands. She stared at the words, trying to make sense of this revelation. Her world had shifted, and she didn't know how to process it all. Marissa sat on her bed, the letter spread out before her. The soft glow of her bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room as the night grew deeper. She read the words again, tracing her fingers over the elegant handwriting that belonged to her grandfather, a man she had known only as Mr. Harrison until today. Her mind whirled with conflicting emotions. Anger bubbled up inside her as she remembered the pain in her mother's eyes whenever the topic of her parents came up. The hurt of rejection had lingered for years, casting a shadow over their family's happiness. Confusion mingled with the anger. Why now? Why had he waited so long to reveal himself? Marissa's brow furrowed as she tried to reconcile the kind, quiet man she knew from the restaurant with the stubborn, prejudiced figure from her parents' stories. Sadness washed over her as she thought about all the lost years, the missed opportunities for family gatherings, for shared laughter and love. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling onto the letter and smudging the ink slightly. Yet beneath all these tumultuous feelings, a tiny spark of hope flickered. Could this be a chance for healing? For bridging the gap that had torn her family apart? Marissa's heart ached with a longing she hadn't fully recognized until now. A desire for a complete family, for the grandfather she had never known. She's tempted to go to her parents' room right away. But she hesitated. How would they react? Would this news reopen old wounds? Marissa went back to her bed, deciding she needed more time to process before involving her parents. As the night wore on, Marissa's mind kept returning to small details. The way Mr. Harrison's eyes had crinkled when he smiled at her, the thoughtful gift of the journal, his unfailing kindness over the years. Had these been his ways of reaching out, of showing love to the granddaughter he couldn't openly claim? Exhausted but unable to sleep, Marissa hugged her pillow tight, her emotions swirling like a storm. The letter lay on her nightstand, a bridge between her past and an uncertain future, holding both the pain of yesterday and the possibility of tomorrow. The next morning, Marissa arrived at work with dark circles under her eyes, her mind still reeling from the revelation. As she tied on her apron, Emily noticed her friend's distracted state. "Hey, you okay?" Emily asked, concern etching her features. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink." Marissa hesitated, then nodded towards the break room. "Can we talk for a minute?" Once they were alone, Marissa took a deep breath and pulled out the letter. "Remember Mr. Harrison, the quiet old man who comes in every Sunday?" Emily nodded, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Well, he's my grandfather," Marissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily's eyes widened in shock. "What? How is that possible?" Marissa handed her the letter, watching as Emily's expression changed from surprise to understanding as she read. "Oh, Marissa," Emily said softly, pulling her friend into a hug. "This must be so overwhelming for you." Marissa nodded against Emily's shoulder, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "I don't know what to do, Em. I'm angry and hurt, but also curious, and maybe a little hopeful." Emily pulled back, holding Marissa at arm's length. "That's completely understandable. It's a lot to process." "What do you think I should do?" Marissa asked, her voice small and uncertain. Emily thought for a moment before responding. "Have you considered meeting with him, hearing his side of the story?" Marissa bit her lip, considering. "I hadn't thought about that. I've been so caught up in my own feelings." "It might help," Emily suggested gently. "You don't have to forgive him right away, or ever if you don't want to, but talking to him could give you some answers, maybe even some closure." Marissa nodded slowly, feeling a small spark of courage ignite within her. "You're right. Maybe I should hear him out." "Whatever you decide, I'm here for you," Emily said, squeezing Marissa's hand reassuringly. As they prepared to start their shift, Marissa felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Emily's words had given her the courage to consider taking the next step, whatever that might be. Throughout the week, Marissa's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Every quiet moment at work or home found her lost in thought, replaying memories of Mr. Harrison, no, her grandfather, and wondering about the life she could have had if things had been different. At night, she'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy with a mix of anger and longing. How could he have abandoned her family? How could he have watched her grow up from afar, never reaching out until now? But then, unbidden, softer memories would surface. The way he'd always listened attentively when she spoke, even if he rarely responded. The generous tips he'd leave, as if trying to contribute to her future in some small way. The leather-bound journal he'd given her with its heartfelt note. During dinner one evening, Marissa's parents noticed her distraction. "Sweetie, is everything okay?" her mom asked, reaching across the table to touch her hand. Marissa looked up, seeing the love and concern in both her parents' eyes. She thought about how they had overcome so much together, how they had always put her first. Their strength and forgiveness suddenly seemed like a beacon, guiding her towards a decision. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about meeting with Grandpa." Her parents exchanged a surprised glance but didn't interrupt. "I'm still angry," Marissa continued, her voice growing stronger. "But I think I need to hear what he has to say, to understand why he did what he did." Her father nodded slowly. "That's very brave of you, Marissa. Whatever you decide, we're here for you." Her mother squeezed her hand. "We trust your judgment, sweetheart. If you feel ready to talk to him, then that's what you should do." Their support washed over Marissa like a warm embrace. She felt a sense of peace settle over her for the first time in days. The next morning, Marissa woke up with a clear mind and a determined heart. She would meet with her grandfather. She would listen to his story, ask her questions, and then decide what place, if any, he would have in her life going forward. On a crisp Saturday morning, Marissa made her way to Oakwood Park, her heart pounding with each step. She had chosen this place for its neutral ground and open spaces, hoping it would ease the tension of the impending meeting. As she approached the agreed-upon bench near the old oak tree, she saw Mr. Harrison, her grandfather, already waiting. He sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him at the restaurant. "Hello?" Marissa said softly as she reached the bench. Mr. Harrison looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. "Marissa," he breathed, his voice wavering. "Thank you for coming." An awkward silence fell between them as Marissa sat down, leaving a noticeable gap between them on the bench. She fidgeted with the hem of her jacket, unsure where to begin. I don't know what to call you," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harrison nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "Whatever feels right to you, Marissa. I know I haven't earned the title of grandfather." His honesty caught Marissa off guard, and she felt a lump form in her throat. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I owe you an explanation," Mr. Harrison began, his voice heavy with regret. "And an apology that's long overdue." Marissa listened as her grandfather spoke of his past mistakes, his voice cracking with emotion. He told her about his initial anger and disappointment when her mother announced her engagement, how his prejudice had blinded him to the love between her parents. "I was wrong," he said, tears glistening in his eyes. "So terribly wrong. By the time I realized my mistake, I thought it was too late. I was too ashamed to reach out." Marissa felt her own eyes welling up, a mix of anger and sadness washing over her. "But you watched me grow up," she said, her voice trembling. "You were there, all this time." Mr. Harrison nodded, looking down at his hands. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I couldn't stay away, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap I had created. Watching you from afar was my penance and my greatest joy." As the morning sun climbed higher, Marissa and Mr. Harrison's conversation deepened. The old man's shoulders sagged under the weight of his confession. "I was raised in a different time," Mr. Harrison explained, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought I was protecting our family name, our traditions, but I was just being stubborn and narrow-minded." Marissa listened, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "But why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why couldn't you see past the color of my dad's skin?" Mr. Harrison shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "I was afraid of change, of what others might think. I realize now how foolish and hurtful that was." Marissa felt a surge of anger rise within her. "Do you know what it was like growing up without grandparents?" she asked, her voice rising. "Watching other kids celebrate holidays with their whole families while we were alone?" Mr. Harrison flinched at her words, the pain evident on his face. "I can't imagine the hurt I've caused," he said softly. "I've regretted my decision every day since." Marissa wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. It wasn't just holidays, she continued. It was the empty spaces in our family photo albums, the questions I couldn't ask about where I came from. As she spoke, Mr. Harrison listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. The pain of their shared history hung heavy between them, but there was also a glimmer of something else, a tentative hope for understanding. "I know I can never make up for the years we've lost," Mr. Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "But if you're willing, I'd like to try to be a part of your life now." Marissa took a deep breath, her emotions swirling. The conversation was far from over, but she felt a small crack forming in the wall that had separated them for so long. Mr. Harrison reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. With trembling hands, he held it out to Marissa. "This is you," he said softly. "On the day you were born. I've carried it with me every day since we lost in touch with your mom." Marissa took the photo, her eyes widening as she saw herself as a baby, surrounded by her smiling parents. Her heart clenched at the sight. "I know I have no right to ask," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'd like to be a part of your life now, if you'll let me. I can't change the past, but maybe we can build something for the future." Marissa looked up from the photo, her eyes meeting her grandfather's. She saw the pain, the regret, and the hope swimming in his gaze. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," Mr. Harrison added quickly. "I know I've hurt you and your parents deeply, but I'm hoping you'll give me a chance to make amends, to get to know you." Marissa bit her lip, her emotions in turmoil. Part of her wanted to run away, to protect herself from more pain. But another part, a small voice inside her, whispered of the possibility of healing, of filling that empty space in her heart. I don't know," Marissa said finally, her voice shaky. "This is a lot to take in. I need time to think about it, to talk to my parents." Mr. Harrison nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Of course," he said gently. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, ready to listen, ready to try whenever you're ready." Marissa handed the photo back to him, but Mr. Harrison shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "It belongs to you." As Marissa tucked the photo into her pocket, she felt the weight of it against her heart. It was more than just a picture. It was a piece of her history, a fragment of a family she never knew. "I'll think about it," Marissa said, standing up from the park bench. "That's all I can promise for now." Mr. Harrison nodded, a small, hopeful smile on his face. "That's more than I deserve," he said. "Thank you, Marissa." Marissa sat in the break room at the restaurant, her fingers tracing the edges of the old photograph. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, each fighting for dominance. She wanted to embrace the chance to know her grandfather, to fill the void that had always been there. But the pain of years of absence and rejection still stung deeply. Emily walked in, immediately noticing Marissa's troubled expression. "Hey, you okay?" she asked softly, sitting down beside her friend. Marissa sighed, showing Emily the photograph. "I just don't know what to do, Em. Part of me wants to give him a chance, but another part is so angry and hurt." Emily studied the picture, her eyes soft with understanding. "That's completely normal, Marissa. This is a big deal. You don't have to decide everything right now." "But what if I make the wrong choice?" Marissa's voice quivered. "What if I let him in and he hurts us again? Or what if I push him away and regret it later?" Emily placed a comforting hand on Marissa's arm. "Look, why don't you take it one step at a time? You don't have to jump into a full relationship right away. Maybe start with small meetings, see how it feels." Marissa nodded slowly, considering Emily's words. "I guess that makes sense. It's all so overwhelming." "Of course it is," Emily reassured her. "But remember, you're in control here. You get to set the pace, decide how much you want to share or how often you want to meet." Marissa felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. "You're right. I don't have to figure it all out today. I can take my time." Emily smiled warmly. "Exactly. And whatever you decide, I'm here for you. We all are." Marissa returned the smile, grateful for her friend's support. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she felt a little steadier knowing she didn't have to face it alone. The familiar chime of the restaurant's door signaled Mr. Harrison's arrival that Sunday morning. Marissa felt a flutter in her stomach as she saw him enter, his usual reserved demeanor softened by a hesitant smile. As she approached his table, Marissa took a deep breath. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Good morning, Marissa," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with a mix of hope and uncertainty. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then Marissa found herself asking, "How are you doing today?" Mr. Harrison's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised by the personal touch. I'm doing all right, thank you. And you?" "I'm okay," Marissa answered, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease a bit. "The usual for you today?" He nodded, then added, "Actually, I was wondering if you might have a moment to chat when you're not too busy." Marissa hesitated for a second before nodding. "Sure, I can do that." As she went about her duties, Marissa found herself stealing glances at her grandfather. She noticed things she hadn't before. The way his hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee cup, the deep lines etched around his eyes that spoke of years of regret. When there was a lull in customers, Marissa made her way back to Mr. Harrison's table. "So," she began, sliding into the seat across from him, "you wanted to talk?" Mr. Harrison nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "I just wanted to thank you, Marissa, for giving me a chance to explain myself, even though I don't deserve it." Marissa felt a lump form in her throat. It's not easy," she admitted. "But I'm trying to understand." "That's more than I could have hoped for," Mr. Harrison said softly. "I've made so many mistakes, Marissa. I've missed out on so much. Your graduations, your birthdays. I can never get those back." As he spoke, Marissa saw not just her estranged grandfather, but a man weighed down by years of regret and loneliness. It didn't erase the hurt, but it helped her see him in a new light. "We can't change the past," Marissa found herself saying, "but maybe we can work on the future?" Mr. Harrison's eyes welled up with tears. "I'd like that very much," he whispered. Mr. Harrison took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and trepidation. "Marissa," he said softly, "I know I'm asking for a lot, but I was wondering if there might be a chance for me to meet your parents." Marissa's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected this request so soon. Her heart raced as she considered the implications. Mr. Harrison continued, his voice gentle. "Perhaps I could come over for dinner one evening? Only if you're comfortable with it, of course." Marissa bit her lip, torn between her growing affection for her grandfather and her loyalty to her parents. She thought about the pain her family had endured because of his past actions. I'm not sure," she said hesitantly. "It's a big step." Mr. Harrison nodded understandingly. "I know it is, and I understand if you're not ready. I just want you to know that I'm willing to face the consequences of my actions, to apologize to your parents in person." Marissa saw the sincerity in his eyes. She thought about her parents, about their strength and capacity for forgiveness. Maybe this could be a chance for healing, for bringing her family closer together. After a moment of reflection, Marissa took a deep breath. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think we can try." Mr. Harrison's face lit up with a mixture of joy and relief. "Really? Oh, Marissa, thank you. Thank you so much." Marissa nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "I'll need to talk to my parents first, of course. But if they agree, would next Sunday evening work for you?" "Next Sunday would be perfect," Mr. Harrison replied, his voice filled with emotion. Marissa stood up, smoothing her apron. "All right then. I'll let you know what they say." As she turned to leave, she paused and looked back at her grandfather. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "I hope this works out. For all of us." Marissa stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing out her dress for the 100th time. Her heart raced as she thought about the dinner that was about to unfold. She had spent the entire day cleaning the house, preparing the meal, and trying to calm her nerves. "It's going to be okay," she whispered to herself, taking a deep breath. But the butterflies in her stomach refused to settle. She made her way to the kitchen, where the aroma of roast chicken filled the air. Her mother was putting the finishing touches on a salad, while her father set the table. "You okay, sweetie?" her mom asked, noticing Marissa's fidgeting hands. Marissa nodded, forcing a smile. "Just nervous, I guess." Her father came over and put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We all are, honey. But we're in this together." Marissa looked at her parents, feeling a wave of love and gratitude wash over her. She knew it was time to tell them about the letter. "Mom, Dad," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "There's something I need to tell you about Mr. Harrison." Her parents exchanged glances, sensing the seriousness in her tone. Marissa took a deep breath and continued. "A few weeks ago, he gave me a letter. In it, he revealed that he's my grandfather." The room fell silent. Her mother's eyes widened in shock, while her father's brow furrowed. "Your grandfather?" her mother whispered, her voice barely audible. Marissa nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "He explained everything in the letter. How he disapproved of your marriage, how he regrets his actions, and how he's been watching over me all this time." Her father's jaw clenched, but his eyes softened as he saw Marissa's distress. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, pulling her into a hug. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" "I was scared," Marissa admitted, her voice muffled against her father's chest. "I didn't know how you'd react." Her mother joined the hug, wrapping her arms around both of them. "We understand, honey. It must have been so hard for you to keep this to yourself." As they pulled apart, Marissa saw a mix of emotions on her parents' faces: hurt, confusion, but also a glimmer of hope. "Are you both okay with meeting him?" Marissa asked tentatively. Her parents exchanged a long look, years of unspoken pain and longing passing between them. Finally, her mother spoke. "It won't be easy, but yes, we're willing to meet him." The doorbell rang and Marissa's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at her parents, who stood nervously in the living room, and then made her way to the front door. Taking a deep breath, she opened it. There at the door, Mr. Harrison, looking more vulnerable than Marissa had ever seen him. He held a bouquet of flowers in his trembling hands. "Good evening, Marissa," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Marissa managed a small smile. "Hello, Mr. Harrison, please come in." As she led him into the living room, the tension in the air was palpable. Marissa's parents stood side by side, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Mr. Harrison stopped a few feet away from them, his eyes darting between their faces. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening. Marissa's mother was the first to break the ice. She took a small step forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Welcome, Dad," she said, her voice warm despite the hint of nervousness. "We're glad you could join us for dinner." Mr. Harrison's shoulders visibly relaxed at her words. "Thank you for having me," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I brought these for you." He held out the bouquet, his hands still shaking slightly. Marissa's mother accepted the flowers with a gentle smile. "They're beautiful. Thank you." Marissa watched as her father shifted uncomfortably, his eyes never leaving Mr. Harrison. The older man seemed to shrink under his gaze. "Why don't we all sit down?" Marissa suggested, hoping to ease the tension. As they moved towards the couch, Marissa's mother spoke again. "Can I get you something to drink? Water? Tea?" "Water would be lovely, thank you," Mr. Harrison replied, grateful for her kindness. As they settled around the dinner table, the aroma of Marissa's mother's famous pot roast filled the air. At first, the conversation was stilted, with long pauses and awkward glances. But as they began to eat, the delicious food seemed to work its magic, slowly melting away some of the tension. Marissa's mother, in an attempt to lighten the mood, began to share a story from Marissa's childhood. "Do you remember when Marissa was 5 and insisted on wearing her princess costume to the grocery store?" she said, a fond smile playing on her lips. Marissa blushed but couldn't help chuckling. "Mom, I can't believe you're bringing that up." Her father joined in, his eyes twinkling. "And don't forget how she twirled down every aisle, waving her wand at the vegetables to make them grow bigger." The room filled with laughter, and even Mr. Harrison cracked a smile. He leaned forward, his interest piqued. What other adventures did little Marissa get up to? Encouraged by his interest, Marissa's parents began to share more stories. They talked about Marissa's first day of school, her determination to learn to ride a bike, and the time she organized a neighborhood talent show to raise money for the local animal shelter. As they spoke, Mr. Harrison listened intently, his eyes never leaving their faces. He seemed to be drinking in every detail, making up for all the years he had missed. Marissa watched her grandfather, noticing the mix of emotions playing across his face: joy, regret, and a deep longing. She felt a tug at her heart, realizing how much he had missed out on. Sensing a lull in the conversation, Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. I have a story too, if you'd like to hear it," he said hesitantly. Marissa and her parents nodded, curious. Mr. Harrison's eyes misted over as he began to speak. "When your mother was about Marissa's age," he said, looking at Marissa's mom, "she used to love stargazing. We had this old telescope, and every clear night she'd beg me to set it up in the backyard." As Mr. Harrison shared his memory, Marissa saw her mother's eyes fill with tears. It was a bittersweet moment, a glimpse into a past they had all but forgotten. As the dinner conversation lulled, Mr. Harrison set down his fork and took a deep breath. His eyes, filled with a mix of sorrow and determination, moved from Marissa to her parents. I have something important to say," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I owe you all an apology, a big one." The room fell silent, and Marissa could feel the tension in the air. Her parents exchanged a quick glance before turning their attention back to Mr. Harrison. "What I did, cutting you out of my life because of your marriage," he continued, looking directly at Marissa's parents. "It was wrong. So terribly wrong. I was stubborn and narrow-minded, and I let my prejudices blind me to what really mattered. Family." Tears welled up in Mr. Harrison's eyes as he spoke. "I've missed out on so much. Your wedding, Marissa's birth, all those precious moments. I can never get those back. And I know I've caused you all so much pain." Marissa watched as her mother reached for her father's hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Mr. Harrison said, his voice cracking. "I don't deserve it, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am. For everything. For the hurt I caused, for the years of silence, for not being there when you needed me." He turned to Marissa, a sad smile on his face. "And Marissa, my dear granddaughter, I'm sorry for being a stranger to you all these years. You've grown into such a wonderful young woman, and I regret not being part of your life." As Mr. Harrison's words hung in the air, Marissa could see the impact they had on her parents. Her mother's eyes were brimming with tears, and her father's usual stoic expression had softened. After a moment of silence, Marissa's mother spoke, her voice gentle. "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot to hear." Her father nodded slowly, adding, "It's been a long time and there's a lot of hurt to work through, but this is a start." Marissa felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She reached out and placed her hand on her grandfather's arm, offering a small, encouraging smile. As the weight of Mr. Harrison's words settled in the room, Marissa felt a surge of emotion. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she gathered her thoughts. I want to say something too," she said, her voice soft but steady. All eyes turned to her, and Marissa felt a lump form in her throat. She swallowed hard and continued. "Growing up, I always felt like something was missing," she began. "I'd see my friends with their big families, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and I'd wonder why we didn't have that." Tears welled up in Marissa's eyes, but she blinked them back. "It hurt not knowing my grandparents, not having those special moments that other kids talked about. I felt incomplete." She looked at her grandfather, her voice filled with emotion. "When I found out who you were, Grandpa, I was so confused, angry even. But now, Seeing you here, hearing your apology, it means more than you know." Marissa turned to her parents, a small smile on her face. "Mom, Dad, you've given me so much love. You've been my rock. But I've always wished for a bigger family, for more connections." She took another deep breath, her voice growing stronger. I think it's time we try to move forward together, all of us. It won't be easy, and there's a lot of hurt to heal. But family is precious, and I don't want to lose any more time." Marissa reached out, taking her mother's hand in one of hers and her grandfather's in the other. "Can we try? Can we work on building something new, something better?" The room was silent for a moment, filled with the weight of Marissa's words. Then, slowly, her father placed his hand on top of hers and her mother's. Mr. Harrison, tears streaming down his face, nodded. "I'd like that very much," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Marissa's mother squeezed her hand. "We all would, sweetheart. We all would." As they sat there, hands joined, Marissa felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in her life, she felt truly complete, surrounded by her family, all of her family. There was still a long road ahead, but in that moment hope bloomed in her heart, a shared hope for a future together. As the dinner came to an end, Marissa and Mr. Harrison found themselves stepping out onto the porch. The cool evening air was a welcome relief after the emotional intensity of the meal. They stood side by side, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. "That went better than I could have hoped," Mr. Harrison said softly, breaking the silence. Marissa nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "It did. I think we all needed this more than we realized." Mr. Harrison turned to face his granddaughter, his eyes filled with warmth. "Marissa, I want you to know how grateful I am for this chance. I've missed out on so much, and I want to make up for lost time." "I'd like that," Marissa replied, her voice filled with emotion. "Maybe we could start with Sunday dinners, after your usual visit to the restaurant, of course." Mr. Harrison's face lit up. "That sounds wonderful. And perhaps we could plan some family outings too? There's so much I want to learn about you and your parents." Marissa felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of completeness, of belonging. "I'd love that, Grandpa. And maybe you could tell me some stories about Mom when she was little." "Oh, I have plenty of those," Mr. Harrison chuckled. "Your mother was quite the adventurous child." As they continued to talk, making plans and sharing hopes for the future, Marissa felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. This was more than just a reconciliation. It was the start of something new and beautiful. A chance to build the family connections she had always longed for. In the days following the family dinner, Mr. Harrison became a more frequent presence in Marissa's life. He started joining the family for Sunday dinners after his usual visit to the restaurant, and these gatherings quickly became a cherished tradition. As Marissa's high school graduation approached, Mr. Harrison took a keen interest in her preparations. He listened intently as she talked about her college plans, offering words of encouragement and support. On the big day, Marissa scanned the crowd of proud parents and family members, her heart swelling when she spotted Mr. Harrison sitting next to her parents. His face beamed with pride as she walked across the stage to receive her diploma. After the ceremony, he presented her with a beautiful leather-bound journal, much like the one he had given her at the restaurant. "For your college adventures," he said, his eyes twinkling. "I can't wait to hear all about them." Marissa hugged him tightly, tears of joy in her eyes. "Thank you, Grandpa. It means so much to have you here." In the weeks that followed, Mr. Harrison became an invaluable source of support as Marissa prepared for college. He helped her sort through financial aid paperwork, offering advice based on his years of experience in business. They spent hours talking about her future, with Mr. Harrison sharing stories from his own college days. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch swing, Marissa turned to her grandfather. "You know, I never thought I'd have this," she said softly. "Have what, dear?" Mr. Harrison asked. "A grandfather who cares so much," Marissa replied, her voice filled with emotion. "Someone who believes in me and wants to help me succeed." Mr. Harrison's eyes misted over. "Oh, Marissa, he said, patting her hand. I may have come into your life late, but I promise you, I'll always be here for you now. As the summer progressed, their bond deepened. Marissa found herself turning to her grandfather for advice on everything from choosing classes to dealing with pre-college jitters. His calm wisdom and unwavering support became a cornerstone in her life, helping her feel more confident about the journey ahead. As the summer days grew shorter and Marissa's departure for college drew near, Mr. Harrison asked her to meet him for lunch at a quaint cafe downtown. Marissa arrived, curious about what her grandfather wanted to discuss. Mr. Harrison greeted her with a warm smile, his eyes twinkling with excitement. I have something important to talk to you about, dear, he said as they settled into their seats. Marissa nodded, her heart fluttering with anticipation. What is it, Grandpa? Mr. Harrison took a deep breath and reached across the table to hold Marissa's hand. Marissa, I've been thinking a lot about your future and how I can be a part of it. I know I've missed out on so many years and I want to make up for that. Marissa squeezed his hand, touched by the emotion in his voice. I want to help fund your college education, Mr. Harrison said, his voice filled with determination. I've set aside a significant amount to cover your tuition and expenses. It's my way of investing in your dreams and showing you how much I believe in you. Marissa's eyes widened in shock. Grandpa, I don't know what to say, she stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. Mr. Harrison smiled gently. You don't have to say anything, dear. I know we can't make up for lost time, but we can make the most of the time we have now. Your future is bright, and I want to be a part of it. Overwhelmed with emotion, Marissa stood up and wrapped her arms around her grandfather. Thank you so much, she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. This means more to me than you could ever know. As they embraced, Marissa felt a wave of relief wash over her. The financial burden that had been weighing on her shoulders for so long suddenly lifted. She pulled back and looked into her grandfather's eyes, seeing the love and pride shining there. I accept your offer, Grandpa, Marissa said, wiping away a tear. And I promise to make the most of this opportunity. I'll make you proud. Mr. Harrison patted her hand gently. You already have, Marissa. You already have. As the summer days dwindled and Marissa's college departure loomed, she found herself spending more time in quiet reflection. She sat on her favorite park bench, the same one where she had first truly spoken with her grandfather, Mr. Harrison. The warm breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying with it memories of the past few months. Marissa's mind wandered over the journey she and her grandfather had taken together, from those first awkward moments of revelation to the heartfelt family dinner, and now to the incredible gift of her college education. It all seemed like a whirlwind, yet each moment was etched clearly in her heart. As she pondered her future, Marissa felt a pull towards a path she hadn't considered before. The experience of reconciliation with her grandfather had opened her eyes to the power of healing family rifts. She thought of other families who might be struggling with similar issues: estrangement, misunderstanding, and the longing for connection. With a sense of clarity, Marissa made her decision. She would major in social work. It felt right, a way to channel her personal experiences into helping others. She smiled to herself, imagining the faces of families she might one day help bring together. Eager to share her decision, Marissa called her grandfather and asked to meet him for coffee. When she arrived at their usual cafe, Mr. Harrison was already there, his face lighting up as she approached. Grandpa, Marissa began, her voice filled with excitement. I've made a decision about my major. Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. Oh? What have you decided, dear? Marissa took a deep breath. I want to major in social work. I want to help families who have gone through what we did, estrangement and reconciliation. I think our story could really make a difference for others. Mr. Harrison's eyes welled up with pride. He reached across the table and squeezed Marissa's hand. Oh, Marissa, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That's a wonderful choice. I'm so proud of you. As the late summer sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow through the windows, Marissa's family gathered in the cozy dining room for her farewell dinner. The table was set with care, adorned with her mother's best china and a centerpiece of fresh flowers. The aroma of her favorite dishes filled the air, a testament to the love and effort put into this special evening. Marissa's parents bustled about putting the finishing touches on the meal, while Mr. Harrison sat in the living room, looking through old photo albums with a gentle smile on his face. Marissa watched them all, her heart swelling with a mixture of excitement for her future and a bittersweet sadness at leaving this newfound family unity behind. As they all took their seats around the table, Marissa's father raised his glass in a toast. "To our Marissa," he said, his voice filled with pride. "We couldn't be more proud of the young woman you've become and the path you've chosen." Marissa's mother wiped a tear from her eye, adding, "You've always been our little dreamer, and now look at you, making those dreams come true." Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, his eyes shining with emotion. "I may have come late to this family," he said, his voice slightly shaky, "but I'm so grateful to be here now, to see you off on this new adventure. Your strength and forgiveness have taught me so much, Marissa." Marissa felt a lump form in her throat as she looked around at the faces of her loved ones. The journey to this moment had been filled with ups and downs, but here they were, together and whole. She felt a deep sense of belonging, a feeling of being truly anchored in the love of her family. "Thank you all," Marissa said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have made it this far without your love and support. And Grandpa," she added, turning to Mr. Harrison, "thank you for showing me that it's never too late for second chances." As they began to eat, the conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and shared memories. Marissa savored every moment, storing away these precious memories to carry with her to college. She felt immensely grateful for the family she now had, a family that had grown and healed, becoming stronger through their challenges. The day of Marissa's departure for college arrived, bright and full of promise. The Johnson family home buzzed with activity as Marissa made her final preparations, double-checking her bags and saying goodbye to her childhood room. In the driveway, Mr. Harrison is next to Marissa's parents, his eyes misty with a mix of pride and sadness. As Marissa emerged from the house with her last bag, her family gathered around her, enveloping her in a group hug. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart," her mother said, squeezing her tight. Her father added, "You're going to do great things, Marissa, we know it." Mr. Harrison stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Marissa's shoulder. "Remember, you carry our love with you wherever you go," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Marissa looked at her grandfather, marveling at how far they'd come in such a short time. "Thank you, Grandpa," she whispered, giving him an extra hug. As Marissa loaded the last of her belongings into her car, she took a moment to look at her family. They stood together, a picture of unity that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Her heart swelled with gratitude and love. With a deep breath, Marissa got into her car and started the engine. She rolled down the window, waving to her family as she slowly backed out of the driveway. Tears glistened in her eyes, but a smile played on her lips. As Marissa drove down the street, she glanced in her rearview mirror. Her family stood in the driveway, waving and blowing kisses. Mr. Harrison had his arm around Marissa's mother, a sight that filled Marissa with joy. The further Marissa drove, the lighter her heart felt. She was leaving behind a home filled with love and support, but she was also driving towards a future full of possibilities. She felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had played a part in healing her family's old wounds. Excitement bubbled up inside her as she thought about the new life waiting for her at college. She was eager to learn, to grow, and to use her experiences to help others. As the familiar streets of her hometown gave way to the open road, Marissa felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Is it ever too late to rebuild a broken family like Marissa and Mr. Harrison's? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel. I am spending hours upon hours writing these heartwarming stories for you, and your support is what keeps me going.